CNBC global energy expert, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Prize, more recently the New York Times bestselling author of The Quest, Energy Security and the Remaking of the Modern World. Walter Isaacson, who this year published the acclaimed biography on Steve Jobs, described The Quest as the definitive book on the most important of global issues, the quest for sustainable sources of energy. Henry Kissinger announced that the book, I'm quoting, should be essential reading for policymakers everywhere. His work's been celebrated by congressional lawmakers, environmental advocates, business leaders, security hawks alike. His editorials on global energy have appeared in the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, NPR, and the list goes on. We've been trying to get Dan here at the summit for a number of years. It's my true pleasure that it's finally worked out for his schedule. I'm thrilled to introduce you to my friend, Dan Yergin.
Thank you. Ira, just before we get going, let me just tell you two things. When I had done my earlier books, the big thing to be on was the Today Show. Now the publisher forget the Today Show. It's the Colbert Report or the Daily Show. And of course, when you're going to go on the Colbert Report in particular, you're a little nervous because you feel the point is that he wants to make a fool out of you. So you're a little anxious beforehand, and certainly put a lot of tension leading into that. But then what relieved it was when I was in the green room, he came in before the show began and said, I just want you to know one thing. The character I play on television is an idiot. And that set the stage.
Well, for those of you who saw the full Colbert interview, you saw him ask Dan about peak wind.
That's where he lost me.
He referred to solar as a dope dream. And Colbert, I think conflating your expertise on solar and oil, asked you, who's going to be responsible for drilling the sun?
Right.
Well, I committed to Dan I'd avoid these similar lines of inquiry in our conversation this morning, even though I will say Dan brilliantly answered the question about drilling the sun and some of the other inane solar questions by summarizing the history of solar. He referenced Albert Einstein's famous paper in 1905 on the photoelectric effect, which ultimately won Einstein the Nobel Prize. So our quest today is going to be to cover the expansive topic of the world of energy, so many issues around it. There are so many issues to cover, but I want to start by taking us back more than 20 years. In 1990, you won the Pulitzer Prize for The Prize, and it's been called the definitive history of oil's role in civilization. Let's start there. Let me summarize the prize if you can.
The prize was really an effort to bring together the history of an industry that had such a defining role in modern world with geopolitics. And so it was really, as somebody said, a history of the 19th and 20th century seen through an oil well. And, for instance, when I was writing I was going to write one chapter in that book on World War II. I ended up writing 4 because from this work I had a whole different view of the Second World War, from the Japanese decision to go to war right up until the end when both Germany and Japan ran out of oil.
You know, Dan, it had such a monumental impact on the industry and was such a huge success for you personally. You know, did you have any idea that it would become the energy Bible of our time? And how did it change your life personally?
Well, I didn't at the time. What kept me going in it, and it took 7 years to write it, and I started the same year we started Cambridge Energy. My wife kind of thought I'd lost my mind because, I mean, every vacation, every moment was working on it. But what kept me going through it was just these incredible stories and these incredible characters and seeing the world differently. But I didn't have any expectation. In fact, I was convinced that a book called The Prize could not possibly win the Pulitzer Prize.
But you know, when people talk about the prize, it's been translated into every language. You know, I know when you travel to foreign countries, you're embraced because of this. I mean, just talk about some of that experience.
Well, I think it's partly when people spend a long time reading a book like that or a book like this, and they hear your voice, they kind of feel they have a personal relationship. They know you because they've spent all that time with you. And I sort of regard the prize, it's like a child that's grown up, gone to college, moved out of the house, have a life of its own, and I'm continually just surprised by the impact. When I was in Abu Dhabi, I met the man who was basically oversees their energy industry. And he said when he came to work the first day, they told him, here's a copy of the prize and come back in 2 weeks. I find the same in China, just around the world, that the book, just as I said, really has a life of its own. And sometimes I look at it and go back and read it and kind of amazed, kind of how did I figure out how to do that? And I sort of look at it and say, not bad, not bad.
Not bad at all. Well, let's fast forward to the quest. It really is focused on energy developed since the prize, putting the last 20 years in perspective, and so much has changed. Soviet Union's gone, China, which was mostly shut off from the world's energy markets, except from exporting a little oil, become the most dynamic element in world energy. No shale gas. We had certainly no Arab Spring. You show how all these pieces of the energy equation fit together, where they come from, putting it together in a narrative. You delve into the history and the future of topics such as renewable energy, climate change, and looks ahead to the role that fossil fuels will play. Talk about some of the main themes in the quest.
There are 3 kind of themes that kind of define the story for me, and whatever I was writing about, I felt these questions were knocking around. One is the question of growth, what you talked about in your remarks, Ira. If you talk about the big changes in the world, disappearance of Soviet Union, rise of China, but the rise of China is the rise of the BRICS, the change in the world economy, right. How demand is shifting. And so the question, you had that IEA estimate up there, if we have a $65 trillion world economy today, we will grow again. 20 years, we might be $130 trillion. Where is the energy going to come from? Right. Who's going to do it, and what's going to be the mix? So that's the first big question. The second is the question about security and reliability. And you need to know it's there, and I think, I'm sure we'll come back to it, but it's very highlighted right now with the rising tension over Iran and its nuclear program. Right. And then the third question, one that animates many of you in this room, is how do you balance the need for energy and energy objectives with the environmental objectives? And in particular, one of the issues that was certainly not on the agenda when I wrote the prize and really only gained political traction, I think, after the year 2000, and that's climate change.
Yeah, you said it took 7 years to write the prize. Talk about how it was different writing the quest.
Well, the prize was sort of like a locomotive. Those who've read it, it just had this one track, and the story just charged through it, and right. It just had this momentum. The quest was a much broader canvas, and I was talking to one of you, I think it was Russ Landon, at the coffee beforehand. What I wanted to do was see how all the elements of the energy picture, how did it all fit together? Right. Kind of sense of scale, these different stories. So there are a lot of different narratives in it. And one big challenge, it was true of the prize, but much more true of the quest, is to find the right voice. Because you're writing about John Tyndall, great 19th century British scientist who was key in the kind of beginnings of climate science. And you're writing about events that happened last year in 2011, and how to keep the same voice, the same sense of detachment through it all. And even when you're writing about something as difficult and complex and hard to deal with as Ira Ehrenpreis. Now that is a big challenge. And that's my excuse. I just want to read a quote.
Oh, goodness.
Okay, I'm going to. This conference is famous. And it is interesting that it started in 2004, because that's kind of when I date, the kind of shift of the beginning of the interest of the venture community in energy. And when I interviewed Ira as a sort of, kind of as a figure to help carry the story, he said to me, this is in a chapter called The Science Experiment, which is the one I think that's most relevant to all of you. He said, my venture brethren thought I'd lost my sense of reason. Closer friends worried that I was committing career suicide by being engaged in the subject. And looking around this room and seeing what's been accomplished and the story you've told, I want to assure you, you didn't commit career suicide, Ira.
Well, let's go back to the narrative. You really are perhaps the best storyteller of anyone I've ever read. You bring life to the characters in the story. You do have a way of creating a narrative and create a significance to the people you tell stories about. Give some examples of that. People like Ari Hagen-Smith. There's so many in the books.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. As one of the reviewers said, this book is geekier because a lot of the key characters are scientists or technical people. And one who I just thought was terrific was named Ira Ehrenpreis. Yeah. He was a professor at Caltech University, a chemist. He had figured out where the flavor for onions, garlic, and wine came from. He was the man who identified the active ingredient in marijuana. But that's not what he's remembered for.
By some.
By some. He was working in 1948 on what was really his favorite subject, his beloved subject, the pineapple. Where did the flavor of pineapple came from? And he went out of his lab, I don't know, 150 miles from here, whatever the distance is, and for a breath of fresh air. And it was enveloped in what he called that stinking cloud of smog. And the thing was, no one knew what caused smog. And yet it was kind of choking the city. And he said, I'm a chemist, I can solve it. And he solved it pretty quickly. In fact, he said on the first nickel and determined it was from automobile exhaust primarily. Because there were a lot of other things that might have caused it. At that time, there were 1.5 million backyard incinerators in Los Angeles. And I remember growing up, you used to burn your garbage. So that he started, and then when Ronald Reagan, of all people, signed the legislation setting up the California Air Resources Board, first chairman was Ira Ehrenpreis, and of course that led CARB to the ZEV, the zero emissions vehicle, and it all ends with the Tesla. So unfolds over more than a half a century, and you see how kind of one thing leads to another.
So, one of the things I loved about the book and about your philosophy is just this constant role of surprise in the energy industry. And it's one that I don't think enough people recognize. And you actually begin the book with Fukushima and the Arab Spring. Talk about the geopolitical upheavals that we are seeing today and the uncertainty that exists and the impacts that's going to have on the energy industry.
Yeah, one of my kind of rules of thumb in the energy business is that we all develop a consensus, and everybody's pretty sure where everything's going to go. And by the time everybody's really bought into consensus, something really happens that changes it. And there it was in 2011, two things simultaneously halfway around the world that changed things. One is Fukushima, still not exactly clear why it happened, the nuclear accident, although the preponderance of view is that it was the tsunami, not the earthquake, that if they had acknowledged, if there had been a possibility to debate things in Japan about these issues, people might have asked the question after the tsunami earlier in the century, why don't we have a defense against that? Well, on March 10th, we were talking around the world about the nuclear renaissance. Mm-hmm. Don't talk about the nuclear renaissance, the question, what's going to happen? And even in Japan, a huge debate about where they go. Only 4 of their 54 nuclear power plants are operating today. But the biggest change, I think, is in Germany. Chancellor Merkel, strong advocate of nuclear power, said it was safe, trying to extend the life. Comes this accident, and German politics completely flips around. They're going to shut down the plants by 2022. You talked about Germany's role today. Germany is going to be the test case, the laboratory of really trying to move rapid fire, and some say too fast, because the transmission system isn't there to support it, towards renewables. And I think in Germany is a great laboratory for offshore wind. So there's a massive change with a very immediate effect on the industry that concerns all of you. The Arab Spring, if you looked at the actuarial tables, you would have said that Hosni Mubarak was not going to remain in power that much longer. He refused to believe that and made the dreadful error, instead of a kind of transition, hanging on till it was too late. And it was called the Arab Spring, and now know that it's something quite different. Some call it the Arab Winter, but whatever it is, it's going to go on for a decade. Huge struggle for power now in the country. It's gone beyond Facebook, Google, and the internet to really who's going to control the military, who's going to control the security services in all those countries. North Africa is still being played out in Syria. What does it mean to have Islamist governments? How's that going to play out? One other consequence that's significant is that because of the turmoil, the oil exporting countries need more revenues, and thus higher oil prices will be part of the picture to meet their revenue needs, and that affects the competitive playing field.
Let's go back. Aside from the bit part I played in the chapter, The Science Experiment, for this audience, it really is perhaps the most relevant chapter, the one that this audience spends the most time on. Talk about some of what you concluded in that chapter and the significance of it. I think that's really where we ought to spend a bit of time for this group.
Sure, and tying into what I call the rebirth of renewables,
yes,
which are the kind of two chapters that are pinned together. One of the luxuries of a book like this is you can kind of follow out your interests and sort of say, a lot of the book is about where did something come from? Where did wind come from as a modern industry? Yeah. Where did venture capital come from as a modern industry? And go back to, some of you will know the name of General Dorio, who was in charge of R&D in the Army during World War II, and really said innovation is applied science, and then after World War II kind of created venture capital industry, which basically then migrated to Stanford and as its central locus, although Boston, as other places, remains a center. And I have a quote in there from Sam Bodman, who was the last energy secretary, who actually is a young MIT PhD, worked for General Dorio in this.
He's a former venture capitalist.
Yeah, that's right. And he said, well, of course, one thing we never did in venture capital was energy. It was too expensive, it took too long, and it was for the big guys. Well, that's a very big change. I think one conclusion I would say, and be interested as we're chatting to see if others agree, that it may be the third stool, Ira, but I don't know what the right image is. It's a longer stool. That is, it takes a third leg. The third leg, it's a longer leg, because I think the discovery's been that it's not the same as IT or even biotech. It takes longer, capital intensive, a lot of government, well, of course, biotech does it too, but a lot of government regulation, a lot of authorities to deal with. And so it's just, I think, in some ways, it's just harder.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You know,
I don't know, do you agree?
Well, I think there are some differences. I think there's some parallels as well. You know, I think biotech, we think of biotech as being less capital intensive, but that's really because of the business model, right? It takes $1 billion to bring a drug to market from idea to the patient, and yet it's the business models that have evolved around that, getting something to an advanced stage where the capital markets and/or large pharma can actually fund that. And I think that's really what we're doing now, is we're working out the business models here, where we can see many of the corporates that sit in this room can serve in that role that today large pharma serves.
I mean, you showed it on that one graphic, and I know that will be your discussion about SunPower and Total.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's a great example of it. You know this. In addition to what many perceive as clean tech being synonymous with green, I actually associate it with innovation in the energy industry. In fact, a number of companies I'm involved with and you know about are really trying to find ways to bring technology to the conventional energy industry, making that production cheaper, cleaner. What do you see as the big developments in conventional energy that affect the overall outlook that we ought to be thinking about?
Well, let me say first, I call in the book the great bubbling, because I think this focus on innovation, it's in clean tech certainly, but I think it's across the energy industry, and I think it's probably true that there's never been such a focus on innovation across the energy industry. And I think part of that is, as you say, to make conventional energy, I don't want to say greener, but cleaner.
Cleaner.
And indeed fit in. Obviously, the big thing that's happened, well, there are two. One is shale gas. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to talk about lead times, because it only burst on the scene in 2008, and yet it was 25 years in gestation to get there. And as you talked about Steve Jobs, it also depended really, it's so interesting, this big industry, kind of on one guy named George P. Mitchell, who was not an oil man, but a gas man in Houston. And starting in the early 80s, he said, there's got to be a way to get gas out of this very tight rock. And the guys working for him said, George, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. And he said, okay, if it's my money, I'm going to do it. Only in 1998, around then, did you have the breakthrough in the hydraulic fracturing. Then this is how events work. Then his company gets taken over by Devon, and they are quite good at horizontal drilling, put the two things together. In 2003, But from 2003 to 2008, it was just something that independents did. And then suddenly, we were going to be short of natural gas. Natural gas prices were very high, which was very beneficial for the renewable industry.
Right.
Then suddenly we see, instead of our natural gas production going down, it's going up. And that's when the major companies moved in, as they have continued to do now. And today, the price of shale gas is a price, or natural gas just wouldn't have been imagined a few years ago. And just 4 years ago, it's now about 35% of our natural gas price, total production. And what it's done is it's really changed the economics of the entire energy marketplace, including obviously affecting the renewable industry in ways that just were not expected. So that's the big innovation question. Is it going to go global or not? And the answer is some places yes, some places no. China is extremely interested. Then if you want to know what the new thing is in conventional energy, it's what's called tight oil. And that's using the same techniques to produce oil. And suddenly, even if you heard it in the President's State of the Union address, he talked kind of about America's greater self-sufficiency. Our oil production is up. He embraced natural gas. So the energy marketplace is changing. And there's a possibility that the Western Hemisphere will be a whole lot less dependent on the Eastern Hemisphere. And as a result, there are many things that flow from that, including some important geopolitical consequences.
What a great example of shale gas is this example of patience and persistence, but look at the payoff.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was trying to reference in the opening, and I think you gave probably the best poster child example of it.
Well, it is, and then I think the other thing that you and so many in this room know too, you need patience, persistence, and resilience.
Resilience, no doubt.
There is disappointment.
Just on the natural gas topic, what do you think, is this good news or bad news for global energy security? You talked about the economic impact. How about the security aspect?
I think on balance, it's good news. Otherwise, we were going to be spending upwards in the United States up to $100 billion a year to import LNG. And one of the things that struck me, there's a much more focus on job creation. You know, we know a lot about the focus on job creation in the renewable area. In shale gas, it created altogether maybe 600,000 jobs. So that's an important part. Whether shale gas develops elsewhere in the world, I was just in Ukraine, you can certainly see it affecting, if it goes ahead, the geopolitical balance. And it's a very interesting thing for renewables because natural gas is both a competitor, but it's also a partner to help manage the flows of the system.
Now, you were on, a lot of people talk about the impact on the environment, and you, of course, were on the President Obama's commission that reported and concluded on natural gas. What were some of the summaries?
Well, this was, I'm on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board. The reason I missed getting here until late last night is we were having one of our meetings. And there's a subcommittee that was set up on natural gas. And particularly last March 31st, President Obama gave us a charge, which was to address the environmental aspects of shale gas, because there's a lot of controversy around it. And it became clear as we went through it, the general conclusion of the scientists in our team was, and all the research, that the hydraulic fracturing itself, the notion that the chemicals are going to get, the small amount are going to get into the water supply was unlikely, that the real environmental issues were others. What do you do with the wastewater? Mm-hmm. What do you do, what about air quality, because you have all these diesel engines? And what about community impact? Because suddenly you have all these trucks that are driving through these communities that have never seen these trucks. And to make it even worse, these trucks have out-of-state license plates, mainly from Texas and Oklahoma. And this is very, people say, what's going on to my community? And I think on each of those, we said these are all issues. They're all susceptible to innovation, to technology, to regulation, to best practices. And that these are issues to be solved and that they will be solved and managed, but that it has developed so fast that you kind of have to play some catch up on it.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, I've heard you talk about the decline in America's demand for oil and the rapid rise in the emerging economies. Let's go back to China. How's China's demand for oil can impact the energy environment?
Well, let me stand back from that, because I was thinking, as listening to you, Ira, that I have this chapter called The Rebirth of Renewables,
Right.
because, talk about Valley of Death. Those who've been in this a long time know about the Valley of Death. They know about it. But two things happened in this century. One is the focus on climate change. The second is this growth of China and the other emerging markets. In 2000, the developed world used twice as much oil as the developing world. By 2010, it was even. This growth, and that goes back to the first question.
In such a short time, I mean, you've studied the history of energy. I mean, that's like a nanosecond.
Well, let me just give you another example. So in 2000, there were 17 million new cars sold in the United States and 2 million in China. Go to 2010, 17 million new cars in China and 11 million in the United States.
Right.
This is moving fast. And the second reason that, in addition to the traditional reasons for renewables, and this is where I see the Chinese, in addition to their environmental problems, their deep interest in renewables, clean tech, is because they have a problem. They have to meet this energy demand to keep their economy going. Right. And so renewables are part of the way of doing it. I talked to one of the chief energy guys in China, and I quoted him in the book. He's talked about these very powerful winds that they have in the northwest of the country. He said, we used to regard them as a natural disaster. Now we regard them as a precious resource. In other words, I think that this growth of the emerging markets and the numbers that are there, it kind of leads you to say, and I think this is the way the Chinese say it, is they need everything.
It's true. Well, so I promised I wouldn't ask you about peak wind,
right.
but I know you don't buy into this notion of peak oil. How come?
I don't. It's not a emotional thing. It's just the result of a kind of analysis. And you look at the broad sweep and you say, actually, we have run out of oil. We've run out of oil 5 times. The first time we ran out of oil was in the 1880s when the head of Standard Oil said, I'll drink every barrel of oil that you find west of the Mississippi. Right. Then they found oil in Oklahoma, Texas. He took back that
big
pledge.
drink.
Yeah, right. So I think that the peak oil argument is just, it was kind of really formulated in the 1950s by a scientist named M. King Hubbard, and I write about him in the book, at a time of technological stagnation. If you followed his curve, the U.S. would be producing about 1.2 million barrels a day instead of 5 or 6 times that amount. We keep seeing technology opens up new horizons. Mm-hmm. That said, so that the resource base in our company, we have the largest databases on oil fields around the world. We just don't see that. What we do see is that the costs have gone up, and that what happened around beginning of 2004, people said that oil was going to be $20 a barrel and it was going to go down. And 4 years later, it was $147. Last year, oil prices were higher on an average basis, inflation adjusted, than any time since 1860. Wow. So we are in a different price world, and I guess it's the belief, Ira, among other things, the belief is that price matters. Price stimulates innovation, it stimulates alternatives, it affects demand. And so we see in the United States, peak demand, our oil demand is going to be flat or go down, not go up. So, and I think that peak oil was really a hot subject. It was very strongly believed in segments of the financial community, but I think it's really faded as we see the supplies grow and the potential grow. But let me quickly say, in addition to being more expensive, there's a lot of above ground risk around the world that will affect the supply. And all we have to do is look at the Persian Gulf today to see that.
Let's switch to the climate and the environment. Many point to the environmental degradation, climate change as really key drivers for finding cleaner and more sustainable sources of energy. But you tackle climate change in a very unusual way relative to others in the industry. Talk about that.
I wanted to try and answer a question. Again, this was like my own exploration. How did an idea that, after all, is pretty darn abstract become such a compelling factor that, among other things, it could stimulate an industry that's represented in this room?
Right.
So I was going to kind of write one chapter on it. I ended up writing 6 chapters and started in the Alps in the 1770s with a Swiss scientist who asked the question, how come we don't fry during the day and freeze at night. And his answer was there's something called the atmosphere. And so tracked kind of how climate change, a scientific view developed. Again, it's funny how one person with an obsession makes a difference, and that was Charles David Keeling of the Scripps Institute, whose colleague Roger Revelle said all he really cares about is carbon, measuring carbon, and started measuring carbon because up until the 1950s, the dominant view was that CO2 would not affect the climate. And even as late as the 1970s, there was a big argument in the scientific community as to whether we were entering a cooling age or a warming age. And then the question is, how did it then become part of the political process and political definition? And so that's the kind of story that I try and tell about climate, and I certainly learned a lot. I know Dan Esty is here somewhere. Yeah. He was very helpful because he'd been through some of the critical developments in the 1990s.
Let's tie in this notion of climate change and what this industry is doing to the rebirth of renewables chapter. And what is your outlook on renewables? Have we fulfilled the promise? Are we the tip of the iceberg, as I said in my speech? What's the outlook of the coming decades?
I think that the way it's striking to me too about lead times, because we can say, oh, the last 4 or 5 years, and yet basically the technologies, many of them that you're engaged in here, really have their roots in the late 70s and the early 80s. The notion of wind farms. I talked to the fellow who started the first commercial photovoltaic company in the early 1970s, and and by accident they started 4 months before the famous Arab oil embargo, and their business took off. And so in a way, you just compare a wind turbine the 1980s and a wind turbine of today, and you see how much more sophisticated they are. Sure. So I'm not sure that wind should anymore be called an alternative. I'm not sure that it's actually just not another way of generating electricity of scale, particularly the growth. And solar, clearly, as you point out, the costs are coming down. Biofuels, biologists were not involved in energy before. Now they're very involved in it. So the way I see it is that they're going to continue to grow. The overall energy mix, the overall energy demand is going to continue to grow. And based upon what we know today, and could be wrong in 3 years, 4 or 5 years ago, if you'd said, your views on gas, we don't know what, who's working on what. And I'm on the advisory board of the Energy Initiative at MIT. There are 3,400 students. You mentioned energy clubs, 3,400 people in the energy club at MIT. That club, I don't know if there's anybody here from MIT, didn't exist 6 or 7 years ago.
Founder of Stanford's energy club here is here.
So, and I'm sure also a large number of people.
Huge, yeah.
So that's part of this great bubbling. So things are going to come out of it, but I think the lead times take a long time. And that probably in 2030, we'll have a bigger energy mix. Renewables will be a bigger part of it. But at the same time, the conventional energy will grow as well. And together, so that the percentage share may not be too much bigger, but that the real changes will come actually after 2030 in terms of the scale.
But notwithstanding percentage share staying constant, denominator getting so large, it's still a massive
I think the renewables share will grow, but the really dramatic impact of new technologies, just because of the scale, the lead time, and so forth. And so in a way, if you look at the overall energy business, it's kind of paradoxical that, in fact, renewables is a big business today. You know the numbers. It's quite a big business. Small business relative to the overall size of the energy industry, but that share is going to go up.
Well said. So let's switch to security. You have been on TV a lot lately because of the tensions in Iran. How do you see that playing out?
I think that with the UN report at the end of November on the Iranian nuclear program, saying that basically there's not much question about what's going on here, we entered a new period of tension. And it's not just Washington. The Europeans are the ones taking the lead on an oil embargo. Washington putting sanctions on the Iranian central bank, the view being that trying to focus in on the heart of the kind of economic lifeblood of the regime, the oil resources. And the Iranians have come back kind of three tracks. One, they seem to go ahead with their program. They've announced that they've reached the 20% enrichment of uranium, which they say they need for medical purposes, but you'd have to have a very big hospital system to need that amount of enriched uranium. The second thing is that they've gotten, quite aggressive in what they're saying, military exercises, new military exercises, threatening to shut the Strait of Hormuz, through which 17 million barrels a day of oil pass, and at the same time saying to the UN, "Oh, come and inspect us again." On Saturday, I chaired a panel at Davos with the head of the United Nations Nuclear Atomic Energy Agency, and they were just sending their people over once again to have a look. So, but I think that we're at a higher level of tension. I think there's not an obvious equilibrium, and I think there's a lot of room for accident or mistake to happen. So I think this is going to be a very volatile 2012.
Interesting. So in addition to being a brilliant storyteller, one of the things I love about the quest is actually some of the pictures that you include there. And one of my favorites is that 1886 photo of Thomas Edison sitting next to that young Henry Ford. And I know that you've had a keen interest in the transformation we've seen in the transportation industry. And you talked about the electric vehicle industry. Just give us your thoughts on this industry.
Right. Yeah, so if you're in a rush, you don't have to read the book, just look at the pictures. Captions are great. It's really a very interesting challenge to take a book that you've worked 5 years on and boil it down to a series of captions. It's a very good discipline. And I had this picture, it's a picture of...
It's a substitute for the Cliff Notes?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Of Thomas Edison having dinner with this young engineer from the Detroit Edison named Henry Ford. Actually, I'd love to Photoshop and put your picture in there too, Ira. In it, that's when Ford was explaining to Edison his idea for an automobile, and Edison says, "Sounds like a very good idea, young man." And he said, "No, I like that fuel you're going to use, that hydrocarbon." Well, Ford went off, quit Detroit Edison, and started the company. Edison changed his mind and decided actually these cars were polluting and dirty, and that he could do it with a battery. He put a lot of time and effort into it, and there were cars called the Edisons that scooted around, and electric cars were known as ladies' cars and doctors' cars. Ladies' cars because you didn't have to crank them, and doctors' cars because for some reason doctors used them for house calls into the 1920s. But of course, gasoline was cheap. The Model T came out in 1908, $825. That was without the top, but still, it kind of revolutionized things. And it's interesting to me, Ira, because I remember when we started talking, that even if we went back into the dark ages, 2006, 2005, it was all about biofuels and ethanol.
Yeah.
And that was what it was going to be. And I don't know when the bell rang for you, but by 2008, it was pretty clear that it was really the return of the electric car.
Right.
For a lot of reasons. And obviously, Tesla figured out one very practical way to go about it. Others went down other routes.
Yeah.
And so I think where we are, I saw that handsome car out there, and the last picture in the book is a rendering or a picture of the new Tesla.
The sedan and the Roadster.
Yeah, exactly. With the Roadster behind the sedan leading the cavalcade. And there's a picture of Carlos Ghosn, the CEO of Nissan Renault, charging an electric car, and right above him is a picture of a woman charging an electric car in 1910, and he's doing it in 2010, and it sort of looks like the same picture. But we do know that...
I'm sure Carlos appreciates that.
Well, I saw him, and I couldn't tell if he was amused. Couldn't tell. But I think that, when you look at the numbers, you obviously know this field very intensely. It seems that a lot of different things are happening in the automobile industry at the same time, and that clearly the race that seemed to end a century ago has begun again in the US, in China, and we forget Japan is there too with their battery expertise, and Korea. And so I think it's probably about 5 or 6 years till we get a sense of what the scale is going to look like of all of this. But a lot of different things are happening that just say our automobile fleet is going to be more diversified and electric vehicles will be part of it. I talked recently to the operator of a very well-known company with a large fleet, and I just noticed that they are more interested in electric vehicles today than they were about 2 or 3 years ago.
Interesting. So, when I read The Quest, to me the most significant theme of it was really your faith in human ingenuity and technological innovation. And you heard me end my talk just now with the Steve Jobs and really the calling for the Steve Jobs of our industry. Talk about the importance of innovation and the role that the clean tech sector, this sector, is having on the energy industry.
Well, I think that it's obviously the sector's gone from being a fringe to very much a player and part of it. There are going to be ups and downs. There are going to be, the industry will need to, as time goes on, move beyond subsidies or incentives of one kind or another. And, that's what you see happening in terms of driving down the cost to get there. But the larger picture, you work on a book like this for 5 years, and then the hardest thing to write is actually the conclusion, because you've got to say, what does it mean, not only for all of you as the readers, but what does it mean for me? What did I learn from it? And there was a quote, I came across a quote from a man named Sadi Carnot. Some of you will know the Carnot cycle, the steam engine. And it was really interesting because I talked to engineering students, they all know the Carnot cycle, they have no idea who Sadi Carnot was. And he was a French scientist engineer. And in the 1820s, he wrote a paper, I think it was called On the Motive Force of Fire, to explain how the steam engine worked. And it was interesting because he was not only a scientist engineer, but he was also a soldier. His father had been Napoleon's defense minister. And he was convinced that the British had defeated the French, partly because of their mastery of this energy technology called the steam engine. And he wanted to get the French up to speed, so to speak. But what was interesting to me is a quote. He talked about this harnessing of energy being a great revolution in human affairs. And that really resonated for me, because this book is basically about innovation. And, we as a species, we haven't been at it for all that long. A couple of centuries is all it's been. And look what's accomplished. And so there's this tendency at any given point to think technology's over. We're, what was it in the 1890s? They were going to close down the patent office because everything had been discovered. And if anything, we have a more innovative culture than we've ever done before. And one of the other things that's happened, and you alluded to it, Ira, in your remarks, is we talk about globalization a lot. Well, we've had the globalization of innovation, that it's not just the United States. It's not just Europe, it's India, China, many parts of the world. And that really means a huge leveraging of talent and capability and mental ability and willpower and determination and all those values that you talked about. And so I end the book, saying there are real risks. There are real dangers of things going wrong, and we're looking at one of them right now. There are, and maybe more than one actually when you think about it. But on the other hand, I hope that the book really, when you look at this history of innovation, see a basis for reasonable optimism for change. And I think the kind of motivation and development that's reflected in the clean tech industry is a critical part of that. And it is part of the Great Revolution. And we know what it's brought forth today, but I think there are things that are going to actually surprise us in a very positive way as the years follow, because of the application, focus, and determination and talent that's going into what's represented in this room.
I want to actually have you extend that one further and ask you to do something at least as hard as writing that conclusion. And that is, I know you've talked about the energy industry not changing overnight. You always talk about that, and I think it's very true. So if we're sitting here on these two chairs in 20 years at the 28th Clean Tech Investor Summit, what are some of the transformations that we might see? How's the energy industry going to look different? What are some of the predictions that you have going forward? And I think a lot of us have faith that you're probably a better prognosticator than the Mayans.
Well, that's a benchmark. Let me see. Well, I mean, there's really two tracks. One is what plays out today, and probably what would be the thing that would really change things is storage, storage of electricity, in one form or another.
How many people here are working on storage?
Looks about 8 or so. Yeah, that if that's probably major change. I think flexibility of fuels would be another. I think like all things, it's turned out harder to get to the second generation biofuels, but there's sure a lot of effort and talent that's going into that. That can change things. Geopolitical, so those are two big things. Geopolitical things could certainly change the picture and accelerate some of the trends that we're talking about. And maybe by 2030, most of the people in this room will be driving electric cars.
Let's hope. So I want to end on a personal note, Dan. What can we expect, maybe not over the next 20 years, but what's the next chapter of Dan Yergin?
Well, I think I'm still recovering from this book. And it's such a big effort. So I'm sort of catching my breath and kind of just engaged in the flow of energy issues and energy markets. I'm not quite, this book was so all-encompassing. After I did a book, after the prize, I did a book called Commanding Heights. Yeah. And somebody said to me, I remember, well, what are you going to write about next? The whole universe? And I sort of feel in a way I slightly have done that. So I think I want to kind of assimilate some of the insights and directions in the book and kind of really, I mean, I'm totally, as is clear, obsessed with the energy industry and see how it develops. I've thought, I've done 2 big PBS series, one on the prize, one on Commanding Heights, but I'm not sure just the way communications and everything has changed, whether to do that again or whether to find other ways to communicate it. But, mainly I'm just fascinated by the energy markets and the energy technology and how these things keep changing and surprising us.
But Dan, for those of us who love those PBS specials, we're all voting for you to do that again. I measure my heroes by those who I've learned the most from, and you are truly a hero of mine. It's a privilege to have been your friend for all these years. Thank you for coming out to the Clean Tech Investor Summit. We've reached the peak interview here. Right. So I want to really just thank you for all you do for the industry and for sharing your thoughts and insights. Please join me in thanking Dan Yergin.
Thank you all very much.
So Dan has been gracious enough. During this next half-hour break, we're going to have a book signing. There'll be a table where Dan is going to be signing The Quest. So please take advantage of that with Dan being here.
If my mic is still on, if it's still on, just tell you one last thing. So what Ira was referring to, so at the end of the Colbert Report, since we started there, he did what I knew the question he was going to do. He looked at this book and started saying, how many trees did you kill? And I was about to say to him, ebook, sort of get like that. And he said, we're done. Peak interview, we're out of here.
Yeah, he cut you off.
Peak interview, so thank you all very much.
Okay, well, I won't cut you off. Thanks, Dan.